we'll eat chicken, rice, and broccoli for years and not call it restrictive, but then we'll be like, oh, but vegan is restrictive. It's like, no way, look at all the legumes, like look at all the incredible products and fruits and vegetables and spices we have. Eating this way is incredibly joyful.
Hey, friends and listeners of the Switch for Good podcast. Yep, that's you. I have some really exciting news. Dotsie and I have started a Switch for Good podcast Facebook group. We created it so we can build a community of fans that will help us improve the show and deliver on the topics that you want to learn more about. So we want to hear what your favorite content is, what you want more of, and what you want less of. And if you like the length of the show, Dotsie and I are always talking about the length of the show, right, Dotsie?
Yes.
We want to tailor our show around the needs and desires of our incredible listeners, almost 500,000 of you. And it's really simple to join. Just go to our Switch for Good Facebook page. That's Switch, the number 4, and then Good. And then click on groups. And there we are, the Switch for Good podcast chat. You can post directly in the group, share ideas, talk to other listeners, and connect with like-minded folks. So go, run, join our Facebook group and tell us what you want. Well, everybody, it's Alexandra, and I'm flying solo today because Dotsie got caught at O'Hare last night and she couldn't get in for our interview today. But luckily, I'm not alone. We have a wonderful guest. Her name is Desiree Nielsen, and she is a registered plant-based dietitian and national best-selling author. Her practice focuses chronic digestive and inflammatory diseases, and Desiree helps her clients heal with plant-based approaches that lead to optimal health. Now, you may have already heard of Desiree through her podcast, the Allsorts Podcast, but she's also been featured in People Magazine, Self, USA Today, among many others. And she now has her 3rd book out called Good for Your Gut. It's both a cookbook and a great read to learn about how to have a healthy digestive system. Her practical, lighthearted approach draws in listeners, readers, and clients from all over the world, and we're about to experience that firsthand. When she's not being Superwoman, Desiree spends most of her time in the kitchen with her 2 favorite sous chefs, her children. So let's get to know Desiree. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. I have to say that intro, I was like, I think hot mess more than Superwoman is how I would describe myself.
You know what? Behind every Superwoman, there's a hot mess, but we deal with it.
Yeah.
So let's start with your background. You called yourself at one time an ethical vegetarian. Yeah. Can you talk to us a little bit about what inspired you to become an ethical vegetarian?
Yeah. So, I wish that I could say at the outset it was with the most noble of intentions. But to be totally honest, I was a teenage girl with a big crush on a boy who just so happened to be vegetarian and extolled upon me all the reasons why we should all be vegetarian. And so, it was really the first time I thought consciously about the food that I ate, and a credit to my family that, food was a really joyful and sort of neutral part of my upbringing. And so, when I met this boy, I was like, oh, wow, this is actually kind of terrible. Like, why do we eat animals? And I went vegetarian, for the reason that I thought it was wrong to eat animals. Of course, at the time, like eggs and dairy just not even entering my mind. I was like, of course, like the chickens just lay the eggs and they're happy on the farm and everything is great. And so it wasn't until much later that I understood all of the reasons why I was vegetarian are the reasons why I needed to go fully vegan. But that just sort of started my journey in thinking about food, thinking about the concept that we could be conscious in our food choices and that it might have an impact on our bodies, our health, the world. And it's very much why I'm sitting here today.
And what about that boy? Where's he sitting?
I have no idea.
Oh, have you thought about contacting him?
I wonder if I could even find him, because it's funny, we totally lost touch. I honestly don't even think he knows the impact he had on my life whatsoever, because he was not into me whatsoever.
Well, okay. So already one strike against him.
I know.
But But yeah, you could find, do you remember his last name?
I could probably, if pressed, I could go through some of my old yearbooks for sure. I have the worst memory. My kids, it's famous with my kids. They're like, we know you don't remember, mom, because you have a bad memory. And I was like, okay, thank you.
Well, we'll thank him for inspiring you to become vegetarian. So what made you take that next step to becoming vegan?
Yeah, I think just being exposed to more information, and I think everybody, and I like sharing this because I think everyone who is like on the other side of dietary change, where they're considering it, they're thinking it might not, that might be good for them, but they're not there yet. There's a lot of resistance, right? When you receive new information that doesn't sort of jive with how you live, and there's that sort of cognitive dissonance, like these things are important to me, but I'm living my life in a way that is not aligned with the things I feel are important. And so I think, throughout my 20s and 30s, when hearing about, sort of industrial agriculture and learning more about how we bring milk and how we bring eggs to our plate, and that it wasn't exactly what I had in mind, of this bucolic, beautiful scene, it really sort of like, it sat uncomfortably with me. And so it took me a long time to be like, you know what? This is not in accordance. I'm not living in accordance with my values and my goals. And I made a plan and I allowed it to happen gradually. Some people can do it overnight, but for me, I was like, I needed to feel like I was not depriving myself of the foods that I wanted, that I knew the foods and the ways of cooking that could get me to where I wanted to go without dairy and eggs. And so it took me a little bit of time. But then when people ask me now, because I used to be one of those people who said I'd be vegan except for the cheese. Now I don't miss it. Not even, I don't even think about it. And people are like, really? You don't? I was like, nope. I know all of these ways of cooking that are so delicious. I make all of my favorite foods in a way that like I would actually prefer now. And so, for anyone listening to this who's like, I'm not quite sure, it's like you can get there. You need to listen to your body, understand that you need patience with yourself to give yourself time, but everybody can make this change.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. I was vegetarian for 33 years and I had an eating disorder when I was in my teens and 20s. And I used that as a reason, like I was afraid to restrict myself, and that I might go back into my eating disorder, and which was a very logical concern. But what brings this all to mind is that you talked about alignment, and that when I aligned completely my values with my eating, there was really, if anything, I became much less likely to go back to an eating disorder. And it's not as restrictive, because people who are omnivores, they eat basically what, 3 different meats maybe generally, and there's chicken, pork, and beef, right? Am I right? Turkey maybe once a year, and they complain about how dry it is. And and then they have 1 milk, and we have 10 milks, 10 alternative milks, right? So
it's so true. And I really appreciate you mentioning that, because I do think for many of us in this culture, whether we have dealt with and moved through an eating disorder, or simply like the disordered thoughts that like this very heavy diet culture places upon us, there can be some fear about restricting. And, even when I first became a dietitian, many dietitians called a vegan diet a restrictive diet, which could not be further from the truth. Like in my practice, I practice something that I call positive additive nutrition. The idea that we focus on what to eat more of. And when it comes to plants, there is so much abundance. And I think that's really one of my main messages in talking about food and talking about nutrition, because we do think of healthy eating as restrictive or deprivation. And so I'm here to bust that. Like all of the things that you love to eat not only can be done with plants, but can be done in an incredibly flavorful, joyful, abundant way. Like we have so many different things that we can eat. And I do think that when you make the transition to plant-based, whenever you make a dietary change, it really sort of like busts those routines of exactly like, am I eating like rice and like my 75,000th like chicken breast tonight, right? Like we'll eat chicken, rice, and broccoli for years and not call it restrictive, but then we'll be like, oh, but vegan is restrictive. It's like, no way, look at all the legumes, like look at all the incredible products and fruits and vegetables and spices we have. Eating this way is incredibly joyful.
Now, you mentioned being a dietitian. You're a registered dietitian, and I heard you talk about when you were in school, which was just 10 years ago or so, they taught you that non-heme iron, which is the iron that comes from plants, is not as good as heme iron, and that to get enough protein, if you weren't eating meat, you needed to combine rice and beans, etc.
Yeah, very much so, and that mythology still exists today. Like many practitioners talk about how, plant-based iron or plant-based zinc is, very unbioavailable. And, some people actually still counsel that because of that perceived lack of bioavailability, we should actually reach for 50% more iron and zinc than the average omnivore population, which is like a ludicrous amount. Like you think for, a menstruating adult, that puts you up to, I think, like 27 milligrams of iron a day, which, you could actually still do on a plant-based diet, but it's a lot of iron. And it really speaks to how little research we have on real life applications of diet. Like even in terms of protein, utilization and like the quote unquote biological quality of plant proteins. So much of that research is done, some of them on like raw legumes, for example. Who eats a raw chickpea? Of course, like the protein is not going to be very bioavailable or to the same quality, as animal products because it's raw. So I think there's a lot of flaws in how we approached the notion of like quality and bioavailability with respect to plant foods and the nutrients they contain. But what is good is that we do have a vast body of literature telling us how when we eat more plant foods, all of the numerous positive health outcomes. So people who eat more plants not only have a more robust, diverse gut microbiome, but vegetarians and vegans typically have lower rates of chronic disease, greater longevity overall. So while we're quibbling about protein quality or like heme or non-heme iron, we get to look at the big picture where we see that this dietary pattern brings evidence-defined benefits to human health. The idea of quality protein came from two places. One, the concept of a quote unquote complete protein, which is a huge myth in nutrition. The idea that plant proteins aren't complete, which means there are two kinds of amino acids in proteins. So some that we call essential. And whenever we say essential in human nutrition, that means that we have to eat them. The body can't make them, so we have to consume them from food. A great example is omega-3 fatty acids are essential because our body just can't make them. Like we have to get them from food. So some amino acids are essential, whereas some are non-essential, like our body can actually produce them from other amino acids. And so there was this idea that plant proteins don't contain all the essential amino acids, which is actually incorrect. It's that plant proteins often have what we call a limiting amino acid. So one of the essential amino acids that's a little lower and out of balance than the other ones. However, no one is eating a single food. So like we're not just like eating wheat berries all day, or we're not just eating kale all day. So as long as you consume a wide variety of foods, as we are wont to do on a plant-based diet, your body takes all of the amino acids they contain and can use them to package the proteins and create the proteins that it needs. You don't have to protein combine at a single plate. You get high quality, bioavailable, usable protein from plants, just the same as you do from animal proteins, without all of the potential negative health effects of consuming those animal proteins.
And heme iron and non-heme iron, once it gets to you, is it the same iron?
Yeah. So, it's It is different. It is a different kind of iron. And this is actually a good thing because something that's often not talked about, particularly with respect to digestive health, is that heme iron can be a gut irritant and actually pro-inflammatory in the human gut, particularly when we overconsume it, as many people do in North America. We consume a ton of animal products and a ton of red meat, and this can actually drive inflammation. Eating a lot of animal proteins with their high saturated fat as well drives a very pro-inflammatory gut microbiome. And so while it is true that the iron from plant foods are less bioavailable, that's not necessarily a bad thing. And there's a couple of things that we can do to improve our absorption of iron, namely not consuming them with calcium supplements, for example. Like you can have a glass of like almond milk, no problem, but we don't take like a big calcium supplement alongside our plant-based iron. The other thing that really helps us absorb more iron from plant foods is vitamin C. And so many plant foods are naturally rich in vitamin C that when you're consuming them at a meal with plant-based protein, you are going to absorb more of that iron.
Oh, great. Thank you for clearing that up, clarifying that. So let's talk a little bit about Eat More Plants before we get on to Good for Your Gut. That was a book that promoted an anti-inflammatory diet. You just mentioned anti-inflammatory and how important it is to our health. Can you expand on that?
Yeah. Anti-inflammatory nutrition was really my first love. And, as soon as I started learning about the links between gut health and inflammation, then it like sort of drew me into this world of the gut. But chronic inflammation is very much an underlying factor in so many ailments that we suffer from. And, when we think inflammation, we think of arthritis, and absolutely inflammation comes to play. But heart disease, type 2 diabetes, many psoriasis, acne, like so many things that plague us have an underlying thread of chronic inflammation. And there's a lot of, mitigating factors. Inactivity can stoke inflammation. Stress can stoke inflammation. But what we eat is a really important foundation in helping to keep inflammatory responses healthy because we actually need inflammation. And when we talk about anti-inflammatory, you can think, oh, inflammation is always bad, but inflammation is actually our immune system's first line of defense. So before we develop these antibodies, that are specific to their target, if we cut ourselves in the kitchen, for example, like that redness, that heat, that swelling you feel, that is inflammation doing its job, like making sure everything is okay, walling off the area, engulfing any bacteria that might have, hitched a ride on your knife to help keep you safe. But we want it to turn on when we need it and off when we don't. And chronic inflammation really is this, represents this imbalance between action and tolerance. And the way that we eat is a huge mitigating factor in that because nutrients, particularly those found in plants, phytochemicals that have antioxidant capacity, help to fight inflammation. What's more is that the fiber in plant foods, because of how they drive the growth of beneficial bacteria in the gut, is a primary factor in helping to calm inflammation. And so Eat More Plants was really to teach folks about inflammation because it's such a trend that there's a lot of misinformation about what is inflammatory and what isn't. And then just to show people what it looks like to really commit to a whole food way of eating. Like put all of the colorful plants on your plate and see how good you can feel.
I heard you say that 70% of our immune system is run by our gut.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
It blew my mind, when I first started making this connection, because when I became vegetarian, that's sort of like kicked off my health journey. I'm like, what does it mean to be healthy? And I found the work of Dr. Andrew Weil, who, if people have not heard of him before, he is really sort of like the grandfather of integrative medicine, a commitment to evidence-based integrative medicine, and really started talking about chronic inflammation and how diet can play a role. And it wasn't until much later that we realized, wow, okay, our gut contains so much of our immune activity. And the reason that it does is kind of funny because most of us think of our gut as inside our body because, well, we can't see. I mean, except for our mouth. Like our mouth is the only part of our gut that we can really see. But to our body, which is very sterile, and like delicately preserved in terms of like being walled off from the outside world, our gut actually from the entrance on through the exit is continuous with the outside world. So to our body, our gut is the outside world, and it has a very delicate border. Like our skin is quite thick and quite robust in terms of keeping the world out. Our gut is a lot more delicate than that. And so in its infinite wisdom, our body places so much of our immune support at that border so it can be patrolling the gut space, seeing what's going on out there, if there's anything it needs to be alarmed about. But then what's really weird is that you also have trillions of bacteria living in your gut. And when you think about it, the immune system is designed to help protect us from germs. Like, how does that even work? And it's because there is a significant amount of communication between our gut microbiome and our immune system. So how we feed our gut microbiome determines what kind of a microbiome we have. And that determines the type of communication happening in our immune system. And our gut microbiome can actually help promote appropriate inflammatory response. So making sure that it happens if it needs to happen, but like it actually tells the immune system to chill out when it doesn't need to be inflamed.
Well, this is a perfect segue to your new book, Good for Your Gut, where you have 90 recipes that will help people restore their gut health. So can you give us an overview of gut health in Western countries? You live in Canada, I'm in the United States. Tell us a little bit about how many people are dealing with unhealthy guts and what are they dealing with?
Yeah, all is not right in our Shire. So, we are going through really an unprecedented wave of just absolutely terrible gut health. And so, you know, depending on whose numbers you look at. So a great example is the Canadian Digestive Health Foundation estimates that almost 2/3 of Canadians have some sort of gut health issue going on at any one time, from constipation to reflux, one of the most common gut diagnoses that we experience. There was another really great survey of tens of thousands of people in the US that asked, like, how was your gut over the last week? A full third of them were dealing with bloating. I think 22% of them were suffering from constipation in the past week. Like, we're dealing with this in unprecedented numbers. And it translates to the more intense sort of gut issues too. So celiac disease affects like 1% of our population. The inflammatory bowel diseases, Crohn's and colitis, are looking to increase to 1% of the population. So something that was considered very, very rare is actually steadily on the increase, and not just because of increased diagnosis. Like, something is changing in our bodies. And when it comes to the gut, it's not our genetics that are changing, so rapidly. That just can't happen. It's our environment, and our environment is our stress, the way that we rest, and the way that we eat.
And bringing that environment into our body, like you said before, is causing some backlash. Can you explain what IBS is and IBD, which you just mentioned, inflammatory bowel diseases? Are they the same?
Yeah, they are different. So, the inflammatory bowel diseases have a genetic component and also a little bit of an autoimmune type component, in that the genetics for inflammatory bowel diseases changes how the immune system operates, and it also changes how the immune system responds to your gut bacteria. So again, in these close quarters, you have your immune system and these trillions of bacteria. And if the two don't get along, that's an issue. And we see in the inflammatory bowel diseases that the immune system ramps up a massive inflammatory response that does not turn off. So what happens is that the surface of the gut, that delicate surface, which is there to help us absorb our nutrients, to help protect us from the outside world, gets destroyed. It looks a little bit like a wasteland in an active IBD flare. And these diseases are so serious that very, very expensive biologic medications are necessary to help control the inflammation, and oftentimes multiple surgeries, where it gets to the point that in the gut, the only thing left to do is to cut out the diseased, inflamed part of the gut because there's just no saving it. So in the irritable bowel syndrome is a little bit different. So, previous numbers were that roughly 10% of us are suffering from IBS. They've tightened up the diagnostic criteria recently. So the numbers with the new diagnostic criteria are a little bit lower. It's more like 6 or 7%, but that's still really significant, particularly when you realize that IBS has a massive impact on quality of life. So what happens in IBS is that, unlike the inflammatory bowel diseases, IBS is a constellation of symptoms with a constellation of causes. So we know that the microbiome is usually pretty messed up in IBS. We also know that the gut-brain connection. So we talked about the immune system in the gut, but the gut is also heavily innervated. Like, it has a lot of nerve cells. We think of our nervous system as being our brain and our spinal cord. But the nervous system in our gut actually has more nerve cells than our spinal cord. So the nervous system is really, really important in how the gut moves, the secretions that happen in the gut. But what happens in the gut also affects what happens in the central nervous system or in our brain. So there's a huge connection in IBS, for example, with IBS and depression and anxiety. And there's been some really interesting research to show, because one would ask, well, which causes which? And there's some evidence to suggest that changes in the gut that lead to IBS may predate what's happening in the central nervous system. So people with IBS are far more likely to get diagnosed later on with depression or anxiety than people without IBS. And so for something that's not a defined disease, that there's no change to the structure of the gut, if you look at the gut, if you go in for a colonoscope where you would see the inflammation in the inflammatory bowel diseases, you don't see that in IBS. But the function is off, like diarrhea or constipation, lots of pain, and it gets in the way of your life. And the challenge is, we don't have a lot of gold standard medications to help support us in IBS. But what we do have is a near gold standard diet called the low FODMAP diet. And so we know that we can sort of alter the diet, and this is something that I have in Good for Your Gut, by removing these fermentable carbohydrates, which are really good for the microbiome, by the way. These are our healthiest foods, such as garlic and apples and, chickpeas. But by reducing these fermentable carbohydrates we find in these foods for a time, we can help to get symptoms under control.
Because we need to then introduce these foods back so that the bacteria that thrive on them will also populate our insides, right?
Yeah, and there's this huge misconception, whenever we sort of introduce a new therapeutic diet to the public, there becomes this misconception that FODMAPs are bad for you, which couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, part of what makes eating plant foods so beneficial for your digestive health is the fact that they contain these FODMAPs, these fermentable carbohydrates that drive the growth of beneficial bacteria. But once IBS has sort of taken hold for whatever reason, stress, a post-infection is a really common cause of IBS, then we eliminate them for a time, but we never want to eliminate them long-term, like no more than 2 or 3 months max. And we reintroduce to assess tolerance and to bring these beneficial foods back into the diet for long-term gut health.
So you just take them out so the gut can rest a little bit and then get slowly used to the FODMAPs again. I had a friend who in the 1990s, so this was 30 years ago, she was diagnosed with uh, either Crohn's or ulcerative colitis, and they cut out part of her colon. She had a bag for a while, or her
Yeah.
intestine. She was told not to eat fiber at all. And now, 30, she's vegan now,
Yeah.
but she just ate lots of meat at the beginning.
Yeah. And I see this so often. I've had a private practice for over a decade. And one of the biggest challenges, particularly in IBD, is that there is no gold standard nutrition. So we don't have like a low FODMAP diet for IBD like we do for
Mm.
IBS. And so for a long time, and even now, for some gastroenterologists, they say we have no diet for IBD. So just try and eat well. We say eat well when well, and they give no dietary advice whatsoever. The other challenge that we find, and we see this for IBD clients coming into the practice, is because there is so much inflammation, everything irritates them. Someone with IBD can be moving their bowels like upwards of 20 times a day. And so they come in and they say, I can't eat salad because it just hurts too bad and it just goes right out. And so what they end up eating is a lot of meat, a lot of white bread, a lot of sugary drinks, because anything with fiber seems irritating. And no one is telling them that, hey, you can actually build up your tolerance again. And so that was a big part of thinking through how I wrote the recipes for Good for Your Gut, because in our practice, one of the things that excites us so much is getting folks with Crohn's and ulcerative colitis back into a highly plant-based diet, because the challenge is what feels good on the tummy right now is what perpetuates the inflammation that keeps your disease process intact for decades to come. So we're sort of like robbing the future just to feel comfortable right now. But you don't have to, it doesn't have to be something you suffer through and just bear with it. A great example is when someone hasn't been eating a lot of plant foods, we work with a lot of blended foods. If their guts are highly, highly inflamed, we start with green juice. We let the blender or the juicer do the work, and we get those nutrients into the body any way that we can. I love smoothies. I will do blended dips and soups as a great way. Often, people with severely inflamed guts, particularly when you think about the diets that are out there on the internet, like autoimmune protocol that claim that plant foods, that whole grains and legumes are inflammatory for the gut, which could not be further from the truth. But often these folks are not consuming these foods. So we have to build up tolerance slowly. Like I say, you have to train your gut for that plant life the same way you train your legs for a half marathon. And if you're starting from a place of severe inflammation, you have to do it even more gingerly. This is like a 1 minute jog, 5 minute walk, until we get up to the place where we can actually jog for 5K.
So yes, in your book, you've divided into three categories of recipes for your gut: protective, healing, and soothing. Is that right?
Yeah.
What makes each recipe either protective, healing, or soothing? You mentioned that blended foods are really good for
Yeah.
soothing.
Yes, exactly. So, if you are simply gut curious, all of these recipes are incredibly delicious, really nutrient dense. So, if you're like, I just want some good plant based recipes, all of the recipes are great for you.
Hmm.
But I very much did design this with our clients in mind. And so, the protect category of recipes are for people who are generally well. They just want to keep their gut feeling good, or they want to make it even better. And so protect recipes are actually high in FODMAPs. We want those gut bacteria fermenting. They're high in fiber. They're also diversity focused, because we know that not just the amount of fiber in plant foods we eat is important, but the diversity of plant foods. We have data from the American Gut Project to show us that plant diversity, so eating more than 30 different plant foods a week, leads to a more robust and resilient gut microbiome. So that's protect. We want to throw all that good stuff at you, all the fiber, all the FODMAPs, so that your gut starts singing along. Heal are the low FODMAP recipes. And, this was a very much, particularly for someone who has a deep love of flavor, AKA garlic and onions. I had to set aside my love of garlic and onions to make these low FODMAP recipes. Because what we find in our practice is that many people who are vegan or plant-based will come to us and say, well, my practitioner said that I have to eat meat now because I've got IBS and I can't possibly be plant-based and low FODMAP, which could not be further from the truth. It's just that they don't understand the diet and they don't understand, the FODMAPs in plant foods. So a third of the book is low FODMAP to show people that you can eat nutrient-dense plants while maintaining low FODMAP for your, low FODMAP period. And these are great too, even if you're just in a period where like something's going on, like maybe you're super stressed out at work and you just find yourself with a really sluggish gut or really heavily bloated or a lot of extra gas that week, you can choose a couple of low FODMAP meals just to sort of lighten that fermentation load, and then just go back to your normal way of eating. So Heal is low FODMAP, and then Soothe are exactly that. If you have a really inflamed gut, like how do we build that tolerance really gently, really gingerly? And you'll see lots of blended items, lots of cooked vegetables as opposed to raw vegetables to help you get that good food in a way that's more easily digestible. All of the Heal all the Soothe recipes are gluten-free, and the Heal recipes are too, but there is gluten in the Protect section because we know that gluten is not harmful for a well gut. And I think that's a really important message to get across because we immediately like, gluten is inflammatory. Well, not for everybody.
Yeah, just for people with celiac, right?
And non-celiac gluten sensitivity as well, because that is another little subset of the population. And low FODMAP ends up often being gluten-free because the gluten-containing grains also contain FODMAPs. So it's not about the gluten, but it's about the fructans found in wheat and barley, for example.
Yes. Tell us what FODMAP stands for.
Yeah, and the reason why we say FODMAPs is because FODMAP stands for fermentable oligo and monosaccharides and polyols. And so, the Coles Notes version of that is carbohydrates that you don't fully digest and absorb that end up staying in the gut so they can be fermented. And that's always a big thing because if you 100% digest and absorb it, well, it's not in your gut. It is a non-issue for your gut. It's not interacting with your gut tissues. It's in your bloodstream. It's not interacting with your gut microbiome. It's in your bloodstream. But anything that is partially digested, a classic example is the lactose in dairy. And, the vast majority of us are lactose intolerant. We're just not meant to digest that stuff. But there are things like fructans, which we find in wheat, fructose, which is found in, of course, like high fructose corn syrup, sweeteners, but also naturally in fruit. And the interesting story with fructose is that when fructose is in balance with the other sugars in fruit, it's really easy to digest and absorb. But when there's excess free fructose in fruits, that's when not all of us digest and absorb it that well. So it stays in the gut and it can draw water to it. And there are a whole bunch of particularly with IBS, underlying causes that we're like, oh, you've got IBS, but actually someone could just have a fructose intolerance. And that's what the low FODMAP diet helps us figure out. Maybe everything else is great, but fructose gives you diarrhea, just the way lactose intolerance gives someone diarrhea. And so you're like, oh, so I just now eat my lower fructose fruits and then all the rest of the foods, and I feel fine.
Is that why people sometimes say to eat fruit alone, especially watermelon? Or is that a completely different thing? Or is it?
It's completely different. It is a myth. And oh my gosh, I love busting this myth. So,
okay, go ahead. Go for it.
Yeah. So there is, there was a book in the 70s called Fit for Life. And it's really like in North America, the popular origin of this idea. The idea being that fruit digests really quickly. And so if you eat it with other foods, fruit can rot in the stomach and cause all these other issues. Could not be further from the truth. What is true is that fruit does digest quickly. It's small, right? You have a piece of fruit, it's small, It's not a lot of fat, not a lot of protein. It is going to empty your stomach rather quickly if you eat it on its own. But if you don't, fermentation is still not going to happen because for something to rot, which is fermentation, like that's what's happening in your colon with your gut microbiome. Like you want that to happen there. But fermentation requires two things. The first is a ton of bacteria, and the second is time. Even if you put a big meal, like we're talking like a big Sunday, celebratory meal in your stomach starts emptying in about 20 minutes and fully empties easily within about 2 hours. That is not nearly enough time for anything to ferment there. The other part of that is your stomach is highly acidic. It also moves quickly, which we just described. But then it also churns a lot. Like your stomach is a mixing bag. Like as soon as you put food in it, it is there like mixing, like just like your Vitamix. Like that is what it's doing to your stomach content. It's your internal Vitamix. Because of that, it is very, very difficult for microbes to survive, and very few bacteria live in the stomach in comparison to your small intestine and in comparison to your large intestine. So it is physically impossible for anything to rot in your stomach. And your body also doesn't say, ooh, this is the nutrient from fruit, and this is the nutrient from vegetable, and this is the nutrient from grains. Like it's all mixed up, and it's like I said, it's like your internal smoothie. So you can absolutely eat fruit on its own for a snack if you like, but there is nothing wrong with including fruit with a meal too.
Okay, thank you for clearing up that myth. That's because I think I held on to that. My husband makes a joke. He goes, "You should eat fruit alone. I've got to leave the room." So you yourself have struggled with IBS after the birth of your first child. Tell us how you've dealt with it.
Yeah, I did, and wow, my oldest is going to be 12 next month. So it's been a while, and very much, I didn't know what was going on at the time because, 12 years ago was a very different space in terms of gut health. But I had my lovely, beautiful child, and they were early. We do, if you're pregnant, we do something, I think at like 37 weeks. It's a screen for a type of bacteria called Group B strep that can be really harmful to the baby as the baby's being born. My little wonder, though, decided to come at 35 weeks and 6 days. So I did not have my Group B strep screening. And for that reason, I delivered on an antibiotic drip, which I didn't think anything of, and then you have those heady days of not sleeping and eating all the takeout, just trying to get used to life with a newborn. And I noticed that all of a sudden, like my gut did not feel right, like after a few months. And I was like, oh, it's just stress. It's just new mom stuff, like whatever. I put it aside, but then the pain actually got so bad that I immediately went to my physician. And I was like, something is going on. Please test me for everything, including celiac disease, because I'd worked a lot with folks with celiac disease. So I knew that's the first thing in my mind. Maybe I have celiac disease, because it can happen after pregnancy that the genes just sort of flip on. No, nothing. And so it took me a while to figure out what was going on, because I got this clean bill of health, which is so often the case for people who come into our practice going, my doctor says nothing's wrong with me. Clearly something's wrong with me. It took me about a year to figure out what was going on in my body and how to start to make change. And for me now, I feel really lucky because that changed how I approached practice, because it wasn't just like an academic or a professional concern to me. Like I really knew what it was like to be in that body where you felt like it was sort of betraying you a little bit, and like feeling nervous because every time you ate, you didn't know what was going to happen. And so the biggest thing for me, it was two things. One, it was stress. Very much my gut-brain connection is a primary driver of my irritable bowel syndrome symptoms. But it was vegetables. And like a mess, because I always thought I was already a dietitian. I was like, I eat so healthy. Like what could I possibly do? It was vegetables for me particularly eating more. And so one of my favorite sort of like loose structures that I share with people is whenever possible, try to make half your plate fruits and vegetables at every single meal. It is one of the most powerful things you can do for your health. And for me personally, it was a huge step in sort of getting my digestive symptoms under control.
Mm. And what about for people with bloating and gas? What do you recommend for them, both lifestyle-wise and eating-wise?
Yeah. The first thing is to always go get a thorough checkup. Like, even if the result is you're all clear on all the tests, that tells us something. That tells us that we're not dealing with celiac disease or Crohn's disease, for example. But bloating is really complex, like way more complex than I think a lot of people realize. So we always start with like, what are the basics? So if people are really stressed out, if people eat really quickly, like it is amazing how many of us do not chew our food properly. And particularly for the plant-based folks listening, me too. Also me too. Yeah. The plant-based folks listening, plant foods are, quote unquote, hard to digest. Therein lies their power for a healthy gut. But you do have to pay attention to chewing them, because chewing food is the only time we have conscious control of the digestive process. We are meant to chew our food until it is paste-like and unrecognizable, because everything that happens after we swallow that mouthful is based on surface area. The more surface area that food has, the more the acids and the enzymes can attach to it and facilitate digestion and absorption. So chewing your food is a huge one. The other thing is wearing really tight waistbands.
Is not good.
It's not good.
Okay.
So many of us, working from home the last couple of years, like we're far more sedentary. Simply sitting down and spending most of our day in the seated posture compresses the gut. And when you add really tight waistbands to that, you are physically compressing the gut and making it more difficult, because we all pass gas. Like, toots are a fact of life. But the gas should pass freely. I know. With me, it's never TMI. I will talk about all of the icky gut stuff. But everything should pass freely. And if gases pass freely through the gut, then they don't get trapped. They don't get stuck. They don't cause bloating. So, working through all of those things, like how is your stress? How well are you chewing your food? Do you need to, like sit in either just like loose t-shirt dresses or, buy bigger pants or things with a softer waistline? But then we get to the food. A great example is people who listen to you, listen to this advice and hear, wow, fiber is so great. And then tomorrow, all of a sudden, they are eating 40 to 50 grams of fiber. That is going to cause an enormous amount of bloating. Your gut loves routine. You really do need to slowly and gradually and consistently increase your fiber intake to help minimize gas and bloating. There is also a lot that we deal with.
We need to have those bacteria get used to what we're eating, and the ones that like vegetables to flourish even more so they can deal with all the vegetables.
Exactly. Your
Right.
gut microbiome begins to change in as little as 24 hours, but it does have to adapt. And so increasing them slowly is really, really important. The other thing that causes, particularly for women that we see in practice, is skipping meals.
Mm.
Skipping meals can be a really sneaky source of bloating, because again, the gut loves routine, and skipping meals can change the motility of the gut. It can change the microbiome. So if you're a chronic meal skipper, it would be worth investing in a more consistent meal pattern, and you may actually find that supports your bloating too.
You also have talked about going for a walk.
Yeah. Movement begets movement. So your gut, like, in addition to the immune system, in addition to the nervous system, your gut is encased in muscle. And so movement really does beget movement. And so, like, even after a meal, like a really gentle meal, and there's this amazing personality named Marilyn Smith up here in Canada, and she calls it a fart walk, which I just thought was absolutely hilarious. But a lovely after dinner stroll is actually really, really beneficial for movement. Intense activity should be done far more spaced out from a meal, because that will shuttle blood flow to the muscles and away from the gut. It'll take you into your out of your sort of rest and digest nervous system predominance. But a gentle walk is absolutely wonderful for helping ease gas and bloating.
And what about chewing gum or drinking fizzy water? Are those contributors?
They
Or am I
are.
adding to another myth?
No, they absolutely are. So, because they help you swallow gas, right?
Hmm.
So, if you swallow, sipping through a straw, talking with your mouth full, like our moms were right. Like, don't talk with your mouth full because you are liable to swallow gas along with your food. But chewing gum increases swallowing of air. Yeah, as does all of those fizzy drinks. And I love like a LaCroix or a Topo Chico. Like, I very much love it. But that gas has to go somewhere. And so that can really contribute to bloating.
In your book, you talk about the daily three. Share with us the daily three.
Yeah. So I mentioned before that, something that's really important to me is to practice positive additive nutrition, because I really want to bust this idea that nutrition is deprivation. It's the opposite in my book. But I know when I talk about how all foods fit and that we just need to focus on eating more, so many of us are like, yeah, but what do I do? Like, where's the structure? Where's the check-in? Like, how do I know if I'm doing okay? And so, some of the soft structures that I introduce, like half your plate fruits and vegetables, and the daily three, I think really help support people when they're on this more positive nutrition journey. And the daily three are three foods that I think we all need to eat more of, and that very specifically help to benefit our health. So the first are omega-3 rich seeds, ground flax, chia, and hemp. We talked about omega-3s being essential because our body can't make them. We have to eat them on a daily basis, and so many of us don't. So 2 to 3 tablespoons of one or all of those seeds a day, really, really beneficial. The second is leafy greens. So 2 cups of leafy green vegetables, whether it's watercress, arugula, bok choy, broccoli, rapini. If it is green and somewhat leafy, it goes. They're so incredibly nutrient dense. Not only are they typically higher fiber, but they're also much higher in a lot of really important phytochemicals and vitamins and minerals, like vitamin A for the immune system. So important, really beneficial. I find that greens are one of those things when people add greens to their diet, they feel so much better. And it helps show them how positive making dietary change can be. And then they get like addicted to it. And then the third is legumes. So any kind of, mung beans, lentils, chickpeas, kidney beans, consuming them every day. And this one is more of a measured dose. So it's based on where you're ready to start at. So if you're new to legumes, a quarter cup of any bean or lentil every single day. And it is the consistency that matters. And when you rock a quarter cup, you can go up to half a cup. When you're like acing a half a cup, you go up to 3/4 cup. And that is sort of the goal serving.
Because people link legumes with bloating, gas, farting.
Yeah.
What do you recommend to make it less likely that they will have some gut distress?
Yeah. So, the first thing I have to reiterate is toots happen. Like, everybody toots. And so, particularly when you're new to this plant-based journey, a lot of people in our practice are like, I don't want to eat these foods because they make me gassy. Gas is part of a healthy life, a healthy gut, meaning you're eating all of these incredible plant foods, driving the growth of your gut microbiome. But it is about slow and steady and consistent. So when you start with a quarter cup of legumes and you eat them every single day, your digestive tract adjusts, your gut microbiome adjusts. And there are actually gut microbes that don't just make gas. Like, we assume that all of our gut microbes make gas. That's actually not true. Some of the gut microbes make short chain fatty acids, and those are the ones that we want to like welcome to our digestive tract as much as possible. Because short chain fatty acids, we talked about how the gut microbiome interacts with our immune system and how it can help to moderate inflammation. When gut microbes, the right kind of gut microbes, come into contact with the fibers that we cannot digest and absorb that stay in the gut, they ferment them and they make short chain fatty acids like butyrate. And that butyrate helps to reinforce the integrity of our gut barrier, keeping, like that beautiful barrier between us and the outside world. It helps to moderate inflammatory responses in our immune system. It even alters nervous system function and can change the way that our nervous system in our gut produces neurotransmitters like serotonin. It's mind-blowing. So when we eat the fibers and it's like, if you are serving someone dinner, for example, like if you are hosting vegans, you are not going to take them out to dinner at a steakhouse. You're going to take them to a vegan restaurant, right? We are building the vegan restaurant for our vegan gut microbiome because that's what they want.
So is butyrate, if just like if I say I want to have more vitamin C, I'll have oranges.
Yeah.
If I want more butyrate, do I eat more legumes or is it all fiber?
You eat, it's interestingly not all fiber. I mean, I will always tell you, eat all of the fibers. Like the more fiber you can get into your body, the better. But there are actually specific parts of plants that drive the production of butyrate more so than others. So a great example is cellulose, which makes up the cell walls of fruits and vegetables, isn't really a driver of butyrate production. Starch and something called arabinoxylans. Where do we find these things? Whole grains is a massive driver of butyrate production. And I think this is such an important message because in the gut space, there's a lot of fear of grains. Just like how, when people are looking at plant-based diets, there's a lot of fear of soy that's completely unfounded in the literature. There's a ton of fear of whole grains with respect to digestive health. So it's really important to note that whole grains are one of the primary drivers of butyrate production in the gut microbiome. So if you want a healthy gut, you need to embrace grains.
Where do you stand on probiotics? I heard you say on a podcast that studies show that they really help with lung health, but I've also heard that they're discovering that probiotic supplements aren't as healthy and necessary as we thought.
Yeah, there is so much controversy and so many different. I know how confusing it can be for people, like seeking this information and like all of us dietitians and doctors and like we're all saying different things. And I apologize in advance for that. So for me, my stance on probiotics is this. There is a ton of research to show that probiotics have some theoretical benefit. The challenge with the research is that it's all over the place. And the reason for that is unlike something like vitamin D is always vitamin D. So if researchers are researching vitamin D, it's all the same stuff. They could do it in different doses, but it's all the same stuff. Whereas with probiotics, we think of them as one thing, but each strain of probiotic is a completely different biological entity, just like all human beings are totally different, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like comparing apples to oranges to zebras to whole wheat bread. Like everything is so different. And because of this change and this difference, what we call heterogeneity in the research, there's a lot of bodies like the American Gastroenterological Association, which have now suggested people stop taking probiotics. So it's hard to argue with them. I will offer a moderate argument here, though. After using probiotics in our practice for over a decade, I agree with two things. The first is that many of the probiotics on the market are just absolute garbage. They're gobbledygook. They have no research to support their use whatsoever. They're beautifully marketed and deliver very little on their promises. The second is that our gut microbiomes are so diverse. So humans are pretty much all the same when it comes to our genetics. Our gut microbiomes are dramatically different when it comes to their genetics. So even a really good evidence-based probiotic might not work for your specific microbiome and whatever you've got going on. So that being said, I think that the most important thing you can do is eat plants. We know that the research supports that. For others, a clinical strength probiotic that actually has evidence can be really helpful. And it's been really helpful in our practice for folks with ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, irritable bowel syndrome especially. So we will work with probiotics where it makes sense for the person, but always on a trial basis. You give it 12 weeks. If no change occurs, you discontinue. You don't take probiotics on blind faith whatsoever.
And what about the lung health that you mentioned?
Yeah. So this is an interesting one that surprises people a lot. And it is very much because of that connection between the gut microbiome and the immune system in the gut. So when we look at what we have a decent amount of evidence for, there is a decent amount of evidence for use of probiotics when you have to take an antibiotic, because they help to prevent the dysbiosis or the imbalance in bacteria that happens with antibiotics. So we have pretty good research for that. We have pretty good research for IBS. There's, for some people in IBS, it seems like a good call to at least try. The thing that surprises people is that we actually have decent research to suggest that taking probiotics helps to decrease your risk of cold and flu. Like not COVID, we don't have that yet. It's just like the regular garden variety cold and flu. So we know that when we take probiotics, feed the gut microbiome, it improves the immune system, not just in the gut, but in a way that impacts our entire body.
Thank you so much for all the amazing information that you've shared with us. If Dotsie were here, she would laugh. She would know you were my dream guest, because every answer is chock full of facts and information, which I love. Dotsie loves it too, but she gets more theoretical and philosophical and deep. And I love just give me the facts. So you are amazing. So tell us where we can find more information on your book, Good for Your Gut, and your two other books, Eat More Plants and Unjunk Your Diet, are where we can find them and follow you.
Yeah, so my website, if you want to learn more and get a sneak peek of Good for Your Gut, my website is the perfect place to do that. And it's Desiree RD, like registered dietitian, DesireeRD.com. And then you can find me on Instagram at Desiree Nielsen RD. And I'm always doing very nerdy posts, oh my gosh, on my website. If you like nerdy nutrition stuff, all of the posts on my website are very long, very referenced, and go into a host of topics, everything from hypothyroid to celiac disease to what supplements are evidence-based for IBS.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, I'll be going to your website. Thank you so much for being on the show, Desiree.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to talk to you.
Hey, folks. Okay. Back by very popular demand is our plant-powered plate fridge magnet, which you are going to receive for free if you leave us a rating and a review on whatever platform you're listening to this podcast on. So here are the details. Just write your quick review. Does not need to be long, does not need to be a whole story. Just be honest and speak from the heart. Then take a quick screenshot of the review you wrote and email it to us at podcast@switchforgood.org. That's podcast@switchforgood.org. And include your mailing address so we can send you a power plate. We are doing this because the more reviews we garner, the higher we go in search results, which means more folks will learn about our podcast. So the power is in your hands. Leave us a review and zoom, your power plate arrives at your doorstep.
So thank you so much for tuning in today. If we helped you in any way, then click the subscribe button and let's keep hanging out together. We have so much more to share with you.
And if you need more information on actually making the switch for good, please visit us at switchforgood.org for loads of info. And you can subscribe to our mailing list where you will receive all sorts of super cool gifts, discount codes to our very fave dairy-free products, and a lifetime of powerful health tips.
So join us on the journey to switch for good. This is the future.